but we're saying, so now it's going to work.
Yeah.
But do you turn it off back there and then on when? Okay. Good.
All right. Did you get the whole distribution? Thank you guys for your hard work. Come on in. Please don't worry. This is like the worst of
I'm sure you've seen all this before. I'm sure you've seen and heard all this before. No, well, at least this one. Maybe the next two will be less familiar. But this one is in the big course.
Are they coming? Are they on the car and coming in? I can give it a little bit of This is so great to have you. We had more than 40 online last night because Christians Bible study.
Oh yeah.
Viewer.
Oh really?
Yeah. So
I got a lovely email from somebody, from one of the people
Yeah.
there, who said she wasn't from CCC, tapped into it because she said one of the nice things about CCC is that they always allow you into things.
yeah.
I think she was called something like Christiane Daily or something like that. Is it something Daily? Something Daily?
We get a lot of people who,
Yeah.
because I think you should, bring them
Mm-hmm.
and
Absolutely.
it actually creates a very different.
Yeah, it's create branches for people to nest in. Yeah.
So I never, it always blows me. And then there's a little bit of a wisdom in it. And then when we do our big concerts, if I trust the mission, change, who I could
Yeah.
bring in also return people. And so this way, we pay everybody, it becomes free, and there's an offering.
Yeah.
And it sounds, it goes well. We'll start with you, and then we'll do.
The first one will be comparatively short. That's why I decided to start with it.
So I have some patriarchy, some big, which neither of us can.
That's right. Yeah. But will you? So you're going to explain the functioning of the day.
Yes, and I'll do basically some
Well, I hope that I'll be quicker than that this way. To give us more time for the other two. here in Detroit for 9 days. It's a nice long stay. Thanks. Generous host, long stay.
Saturday we get to go down to Detroit, Eastern Market. I do have to do a funeral, but
Huh?
catch up.
That's when we escaped to Canada, isn't it?
That's right. Just get in the road.
I'm longing to go south.
head down.
I'm longing to go south to Canada. I love the idea of going south to Canada.
South Canada, yes.
I'll get started.
When you're ready.
Thank you so much for being here, everybody who is here in person and everybody who's online. You have blessed us by being here. And this is going to be one of those wonderful hybrid kind of retreats. We're going to have some people who are here in person, and I know there are a few others that are going to be joining us. And we also have those of you who are online. And that's part of the miracle of technology that we have these days. We're going to have 3 meditations on the Gospel of Luke on the theme of the Exodus of Jesus. And I am so delighted to have Father James Alison with us today, who is one of the great theologians of our generation. And I am so honored to have so many guests of the church who are here. And we are so blessed to have you with us. For those of you who are at home, anytime you need to stand up or do something, you know that best, and please take care of self, and please have some coffee and have something sweet or a treat. For those of you here, we have bundt cake right over here, and coffee and water, and we're just going to have you listen to your own selves. We're not going to have like an organized time where we're going to go have coffee and have conversation like at church. And Father Allison is going to offer a kind of introduction today on Luke 19. That's going to go for a bit of time. There'll be some time for reflection. And then we'll start the second meditation at about 10 to 10. And then I'll let him gauge and move through the final meditation that will happen sometime in near 11. And I am so grateful for all of you here. I'm so grateful for this opportunity for us to are facing the prospect of preaching or participating in the liturgy as we move through the Gospel of Luke on our way to Golgotha, and on our way to the empty tomb, and on our way to the risen Christ. Thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, will you help me welcome Father Allison.
A quick question. When you talk about meditation time, is this designed to be silent time or sharing time?
Anything you want.
Well, anything that you want. I think that's probably
sharing is fine, or silent.
we can work that out as we go along. Good. Well, thank you very, very much for being here, and I hope that you have access to the text, whether at home or here. I know that you do here on paper because I can see the paper that you have. I've chosen 3 Lucan texts, at least 2 of which will come up in the liturgy fairly soon. One of them, I believe, in your liturgy has come up already, the Transfiguration one, but Gethsemane will come up fairly soon. But I wanted to start with a rather short, sweet part of Jesus' Exodus. I know that Bill chose the term from the Transfiguration reading because Moses and Elijah turn up on top of the mountain and discuss Jesus' Exodus, his way out with him. And this is the last day of Jesus' Exodus before he goes to Jerusalem. This is his going to Jericho in Luke's Gospel. So by this stage, let's remember, Jesus is something of a celebrity. People have heard about him. They're interested in what he's about. They've heard he does signs. They've heard his preaching and teaching. So by the time he comes to Jericho, he's a known to use the late Donald Rumsfeld's famous terminology. Now, the question, I guess, if you were at Jericho is he going to do a gig in our town? Because, of course, that's what you would hope. If a celebrity comes to town, you hope that they would do a gig in your place. But as it happens, Jesus wasn't interested in doing a gig in Jericho. He said Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. But that means that as he goes through, he's accompanied by a considerable amount of attention. He's, if you like, the center of a fairly swirling crowd of people who are curious about what he's about. And because Luke is a genius, he then conjures up for us in very, very few words something about the dynamic that must have been present there. He said, and there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not, on account of the crowd, because he was small of stature. Stature. Now, let's unpick each of those little words, because each one of these tells us something. He was a chief tax collector. Okay, that automatically puts him in the category of a quisling. Someone who is of us, but not of us. That's not because he was, if you like, an employee of a bureaucracy. Presumably the IRS has employees, and these could formally be called tax collectors. But that's not how it worked in the ancient world. What the Romans did, rather sensibly, was rather than setting up their equivalent of the IRS everywhere that they dominated, which would have been expensive and tedious and bureaucratic and have caused them to have to employ lots of people, they outsourced. So basically they calculated how much a given region was worth in tax revenue every year, let us say 500,000 gold coins. And they then said, okay, it's worth that, but it's worth to us at least 100,000 not to have to bother to collect it ourselves. So we will sell the rights to taxing it for 400,000 gold coins. And anybody can buy the right to tax it. And anything that they can make between 400,000 and 500,000, which is the maximum we think they could get, they can keep. In other words, if you were very rich, you bought the right to tax your fellow country persons. As you can imagine, these were not very popular people because their job, their profit came from whatever extra they could get from the taxation system. So, yeah, they were quislings. Now, people at the time were not stupid. They knew that they were going to be taxed. However, I mean, whoever was in charge, there would be taxes. They knew Benjamin Franklin's dictum long before Benjamin Franklin. So it wasn't the fact that there were tax collectors that was particularly odious. It was the fact that there was always going to be a treasonable nature with tax collectors under this system, and they were always, therefore, liable to be despised. In fact, their life was somewhat dangerous. You don't get to hang out with your fellow country persons in a comparatively small society and get along well with everybody under those circumstances. So that's who he was. And he was rich. Whether he was rich before becoming a tax collector, and that was what enabled him to become a tax collector, we don't know. Or whether he had become rich through his successful tax collecting, likewise, we don't know. But what we do know is that the rich person has all sorts of fake friends because they're people who are somehow in his debt or are dependent on him, and therefore who will say yes, yes, yes to a whole lot and despise him behind his back. So you can imagine that Zacchaeus was a person who had, let's say, a tricky, ambivalent relationship with his co-citizens. They could never quite be honest with him or he with them. And another feature which we hear about him, he was small. And this is very much underestimated in this passage, because if you are small, you're used to people looking down at you. You have to look up at people, and they're quite frightening, people who are taller than you. You are small, and you're likely to overcompensate for being small by being a bully. It's not for nothing that significant dictators and world leaders have been small people. Napoleon was small, Hitler was small, Putin is small. These are people who impose themselves by other means. But so here we have someone who had a good reason to be slightly paranoid about his living circumstances, and someone who was used to armoring himself concerning being looked down upon. Someone who had, if you like, a difficult and dangerous relationship with his own community. And here is the whole of his old community fixated on this celebrity who's coming into town. Their attention is not on Zacchaeus at all, luckily for him. It's on the celebrity who's coming into town. And he's moving through, one can imagine, a bit like a hurricane or a whirlwind coming through. And in the middle of it, there's the eye of the storm, and everyone else is going around looking and seeing what he does and if anything's going to happen, and so on and so forth. All the attention, all the gossip is going on. And in the middle, Jesus quite calmly walking through, perhaps with disciples behind him. And here we have the beginning of the seeing and the seeking. This gospel, in Luke's gospel, is all about seeing, seeking, and being seen. The number of verbs of looking that appear in this gospel is astounding, as we'll see in just a second. So if you look at verse 3. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was. He sought to see. So what we have, the first person who is apparently doing some seeking is Zacchaeus. Now that's an interesting thing. It means that he's enough of a citizen of his own city to have been, if you like, contaminated, to have been whipped up with the same enthusiasm and curiosity as everybody else. He's not entirely outside the mainstream of what people are thinking and feeling. He's as interested as everybody else. But he could not, on account of the crowd, because he was small of stature. But he also knew that there was no point in him drawing close to the center of the maelstrom, because he was too small, so he wouldn't get to see, but also because small people with an ambiguous relationship to the crowd, whoops, just such a pity we trampled upon you, didn't mean it, didn't notice. Not a safe place to be. So, yes, he wanted to see, but he didn't want to be too close to those who were involved in the seeing, even though he had the same focus of attention as they, because it would be dangerous for him. So it says he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And interesting, the notion of a sycamore tree. We don't really know what that was like. But recently, and you can find it online, during the first Afghan war, or just before the first Afghan war, there was a rather wonderful picture of a whole lot of Pashtun youth sitting in a sycamore tree, looking over some meeting of Taliban leaders somewhere in Afghanistan. You actually saw what it was like for people dressed in skirts to sit in a tree and watch. So it's worth looking that up just to get a sense of people sitting in a tree and looking. So he ran up and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. So now he's above the crowd and in a relatively safe space. But being above the crowd, which is a position he's not used to being in, we can't imagine, it's not very dignified to climb up into a tree. Skirted tree climbers, it's the sort of thing that youth can get away with quite easily, but a somewhat portly tax collector and rich man climbing into the thing, it's not exactly the kind of thing he usually did. So he climbs up into a sycamore tree. But when Jesus comes to the place, He looks up. So here's another key verb of looking. And the one thing that Zacchaeus has never experienced before is being looked up to. Remember, he's the person who people look down on. All his armoring is upward facing. But he's completely vulnerable from beneath because he's not used to anybody looking up at him. And just consider the psychological shock of the eye of the hurricane, the peaceful center, the focus of all attention, where everyone else had been focused on him, coming up under you and looking up where you aren't armored. It's difficult for us to imagine it, but it must have been a quite extraordinary psychic shock. He was suddenly being looked up at by the center of attention. And guess what? Rather than it being a frightening, out to get him kind of look, it was quite the reverse. The look was an entirely peaceful look. The look wasn't contaminated by the curiosity and potential for violence of the crowd. It looks up and says to him, "Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for I must stay at your house today." Now, it's very interesting, this "must stay at your house today." There's just a hint of an imperative there. Jesus is commanding something. And this use of the word "must," we don't very often pay attention to it. But the "must" here is saying something about what Zacchaeus is going to have to do in order to make that possible for Jesus. Because Zacchaeus knows that this man is a prophet and a holy man. That's what his reputation is. Zacchaeus also knows that he is impure. He is, formally speaking, a sinner. Formally speaking, a good person could not enter his house without being contaminated. There were very strict rules regarding this. So if Jesus says, "I must come into your house," he's effectively saying, you are going to have to sort out your financial affairs. He's actually, that is contained, because otherwise you will not be able to receive me. The only way you could receive me without putting either yourself or me at fault is by sorting your finances out. So please note that there's more of a strong imperative involved here than seems to be the case. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. So we have the extraordinary sense of he's been looked at by something vastly more friendly than he'd imagined, and yet there absolutely was a steel glove, as a steel fist in the silken glove. And he was prepared to receive that. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. He was absolutely amazed. He'd been looked at from underneath, and it hadn't been out to get him. The center of the crowd hadn't been out to get him. He'd been looked at in a way that had actually changed his whole perspective on who he was. But the crowd, of course, they are completely stuck still in their strange mixture of fascination and violence. And when they saw it, they all murmured, "He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner." In other words, they understood exactly what was meant by Jesus' command. And they also knew that Jesus was running the risk of contamination by entering that house. And then it says, and Zacchaeus stood. And actually it's more than just stood. It's a sense of stood tall. It's emphasized because he's coming into his own stature at last. and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. In other words, I'm immediately going to put right my situation of impurity because I'm not going to make you impure. And Jesus said to him, Today, salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. In other words, Jesus recognized his sameness with the crowd, it was just a hint of the recognition of his sameness that had allowed him to want to seek to see who Jesus was. But then, Jesus says, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Exactly the same verb as before. So the suggestion, beautifully brought out by Luke, is that Zacchaeus' seeking had in fact been entirely secondary to Jesus' seeking. That he had come into town looking for the one who was beginning to try to seek him in order to be able to include him in. So this is, if you like, a beautiful text concerning the working of grace. We are sought before we find ourselves seeking. And it's as we find ourselves seeking that we may find ourselves being looked at in an unexpected way. And it's our being looked at in an unexpected way which comes alive in our midst as our being forgiven. And as we are forgiven, so we're able to begin to put things right. To restore, to repair things that we may have been involved in. And Luke captures beautifully the way in which all this happens within the midst of the dynamic of a potentially threatening, contagious crowd, and how the eye of the hurricane, which is Jesus, is exactly the reverse of the threatening crowd. It's one who is not seeking out so as to punish, so as to beat down, so as to trample, but so as to look from beneath and open up and restore. So what have I left out? Help me. Let's see what else we can pick up from this, if you want to talk about it. Yes.
I've always interpreted this verse 8 where Zacchaeus says, I give half my goods to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone, I restore it fourfold. I've always thought that he was saying that was his normal practice, and not something that he was doing in response to his encounter with Jesus. I thought that's what he was already doing, but he didn't get any credit for it because the people were so close to him. I'm not sure if I understand the...
So just if you can just reiterate that for people who are following at home.
Oh, sure, okay. I was just saying that I thought in verse 8 that Zacchaeus was telling Jesus what his normal practice was. And I never really thought that, this is something he's doing in response to this particular encounter. So maybe the tense of the Greek verbs is what I am unfamiliar with.
It's present. Didomi, apodidomi. The Greek verbs are in the present. It's conceivable, but I think that the point would have been made that this was a tax collector unlike all others at the early stage. Unlike all others, this tax collector was a tax collector who treated people justly. Mm-hmm. We don't have any sense of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that a tax collector who treated people justly would have been a fated character. Mm-hmm. given that this comes in a selection of sections in Luke where Jesus refers to people as being a child of Abraham. He's always talking about people who, for some reason or other, like the woman bent over, are excluded.
Right.
And that what he's come to do is to include apparent outsiders inside. So I would guess that that Zacchaeus here is making a proclamation of how things are going to be from now on. But why not? I mean, it would be interesting. I'm not... may 1,000 interpretations flourish.
That insight comes from Joseph Fitzmyer, who makes that argument.
Very interesting. The late Joseph Fitzmyer, I met him once.
We have a question from home, and for those of you who are watching online, we'll be, if you want to send your questions to us in the comment section right to the left of the screen, or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube in the comment section there, we'll try to keep an eye on those one way or another. The question that comes here from home is, I wonder about the change in Zacchaeus as a first response. What led him up to the tree? What can we learn about that as people entrapped in systems that dehumanize?
Well, I think that what it teaches us is that what seems like us to be a very insufficient beginning of something can often be, if you like, a stage much further along the journey to a bigger change than we might imagine. Because we only see a very small part, but that simply the wanting to see, his curiosity, was part of the way that he was already part of, a son of Abraham. In other words, that line, God does not snuff out the wick, snuff out the smouldering wick, or bruise the broken reed, or break the bruised reed. I think that this is something like that. It's amazing how what might seem a relatively unimportant piece of seeing, an apparently entirely insufficient and not necessarily even a very moral thing, may actually be the beginning of something much greater. And that's something which is continuous in Luke. Luke is not interested in people doing good things initially. He's interested in people starting where they are, not being particularly good, and finding themselves being caught up in a goodness. God is not very moralistic in Luke, which is very nice.
And to pick up on that question and your response, I mean, if you look at the juncture between verse 3 and verse 4, there's that first curiosity. He wants to see Jesus. The celebrity is coming to town, as you are beautifully describing it. But then that moment where he climbs into the sycamore tree as a person of short stature, wearing a gown, that's going to expose anybody below him to his underside, and that's a very shameful thing to do. And so there is a kind of willingness to enter into that shame. In the hopes that somehow he gets a better glimpse of God. I've always found that to be something I've never been able to quite put into a sermon, right? Because you don't want to quite have people imagine. But no, that's something that was a classic in the scriptures. It's a classic violation of a taboo to be able to see someone uncovered in that way.
From the underside, yes.
Yeah.
That's right. And of course they didn't have underwear in those days, yes.
If I might, I've often relied on this passage to kind of fuel my ministry, as I've often worked in the church working with newcomers and new first-time visitors. And I've often sort of analogized in my own mind the first-time visitor who kind of wanders into church and sits in the back pew and is taking quite a risk to do so. Not sure if they'll fit in, not sure if they'll be accepted, or likely figuring they probably won't, actually. But yet they're still curious. There's something driving them. There's a curiosity about God that's deep down somewhere that's gotten them this far. And I've always thought of my role as to be Jesus in that moment, and to not just see them, but to radically bridge the gap through table fellowship, like early on. So I am often the person who will invite people to dinner. I don't invite myself to their house quite yet, but I'm happy to invite them to mine, and just suddenly it blows their mind to go from kind of a quiet wanderer into, oh my gosh, one of the clergy's inviting me to their house, you know. And it's powerful what can shift in the relationship and the being seen, and all that trepidation and fear and risk and wonder about whether they'll be fit in is suddenly erased in that invitation.
Amazing ways in which we can enact this.
I don't know that I have a question. I'm sitting in the tension of, we've already been talking, yesterday we talked, and there's so much discussion around the morality-based kind of religion where you have to go do right, and be right, and this kind of flips the invitation was first. But you kind of jarred me by, saying that there's that implication that there was kind of a hint of almost transactional kind of message with the iron fist and the satin glove. But yet I totally get that there's the prequel to that was the loving look and the seeing you and getting you, and so there's something about sitting in that tension of, it's easy to sort of pendulum swing of no conditions versus conditional. There's something sitting in that middle that I'm not sure what my question is, but can you just sort of unpack that a bit?
Yeah.
Sitting in the middle of that.
Yes, I think this is an absolutely central thing. Forgiveness looks like breaking of heart. Strangely, that's the medieval definition. That's St. Thomas Aquinas. The shape of forgiveness in our life is contrition. Now, all the difference in the world is made between, if you say sorry, then I'll forgive you, and because I'm forgiving you, you are able to say sorry. There's literally all the difference in the world between those two. The first one, locks you, as you say, into a transactional relationship in which you're jumping through hoops to please somebody else. It's emotional blackmail. And the other is the arrival in your life of the possibility of a bigger heart, such that you actually want to change things. Remembering that the purpose of God forgiving us is not because God wants to punish us, but on the contrary, because our hearts are too small, and therefore they need to be broken open in order for us to be more real, to be able to enter into reality. So I think that the dynamic as set out by Luke is exactly that it's the arrival of forgiveness that makes penitence possible. And I think that why that's so important is because we are so used, or have become so used to, let's say, a very vague account of forgiveness, saying, oh, God always forgives, God always forgives, God always forgives. But without realizing that what forgiveness looks like is a breaking of heart. The reverse of that is, I think, what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. Cheap grace is forgiveness without breaking of heart. And cheap grace without forgiveness of heart turns into self-righteousness. So I think that the notion here that someone who is in a dangerous place which was dangerous partly through his own fault and partly through those around him. I mean, they come off badly here. They come off as murmuring, the verb used in Exodus and Deuteronomy about the people of Israel complaining. So there they are complaining as the new Moses brings someone into the promised land. They're the ones who are not accompanying this process. But the notion that forgiveness in any of our lives produces brokenness of heart, that seems to me something that we ought to recover as being an immensely positive thing. The difficulty we have is that we are so used to hearing voices in our head that associate penitence with emotional blackmail that we find it difficult to imagine that actually forgiving us and therefore breaking our hearts is the best thing that could possibly happen to us. And I think that's something that we need to recover in any preaching of grace. The priority of forgiveness. What's the definition of sin? That from which you can be forgiven. Sin is an ancillary concept. Forgiveness is the motor. Sin is the thing that gets swept out of the way. Sin is not very important. It's the forgiveness coming into our life, creating, recreating. That's the important thing. Does that begin to answer that?
Translating in my head. Is that right?
It took me a long time to realize that. It wasn't until I discovered from my guru in this matter, which is a wonderful, now deceased Anglican exegete called Duncan Durrett, J. Duncan M. Durrett. His reading of this passage, because of course he was a professor of ancient Middle Eastern law before he became a New Testament exegete. He became a New Testament exegete when he discovered that there weren't that many people who wanted to do doctorates in ancient Middle Eastern law at King's College London. So he became a New Testament expert. But because he knew about ancient Middle Eastern law, he knew everything about, taxation rates, weights and measures, literally, every single dimension of how a Middle Eastern bazaar worked. He knew, so he understood exactly what the sort of impurities were that a tax collector would be in, and what the rates of usury, which was illegal, would have been that he might have found himself having to pay back. So it was when he pointed out that actually what Jesus was doing was making it possible for him to be received by allowing Zacchaeus to get out of his situation. There is something real with that. What made it possible for Jesus to be received was the arrival of this look and this awareness that he could actually be someone and stand tall. And that actually, that the arrival of Jesus in his home was itself the reward for the thing which it made possible. Does that begin to... I hadn't realized that before. I had assumed that there was no quid pro quo in this. And I hadn't understood how carefully the thing is worded so as to bring out that it's not transactional in the emotional blackmail sense. It's the making possible of something real.
What I hear you saying is the focus is on Jesus. The focus is on healing. He could see him past his armor. The themes again of shame. I'm trying to digest your word. The heartbreak, and translate into a framing that I can understand. But if it's really sort of the armor around the heart that's breaking, and that's painful because that's what we've clung to, and that's been his world, and that represents all of us, right? And so Jesus is seeing past that and knows how to free him from that by what you're saying, by looking at him and doing the forgiving, and then it's in that he allows himself to feel vulnerable, and that the breaking of the armor around the heart happens, and then that goodness can pour forth. Am I getting that right? Is that...
I think so. It says So he made haste and came down and received him rejoicing, is what it actually says. I translate it joyfully, but Chiron is rejoicing. Received him rejoicing. The suggestion that, in his case, the breaking of heart was able to happen easily because he'd been seen from underneath, and it was so unexpected. So the initial movement was one of great joy. Yeah. It would have been, again, this is one of the people who it would have been interesting to know the after story. After Hurricane Jesus had been through Jericho, how did Zacchaeus settle down in his new relationships with his co-citizens? It would be very interesting to...
It's going to be interesting as you go through your meditations today, the recurrence of the person who is lost but now found.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that last bit, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And of course, in Luke 15, which you might be touching upon,
I will be
you
touching.
have the end of it is this son of mine who is lost is now found. And in both of those passages, not to get ahead of ourselves, but there's a kind of interrupted and incomplete reciprocity or compensation. So you begin the passage today by describing the tax collector, all the levels of social debt that are connected with being a tax collector, all the ways in which he's been able to skirt the law or to manipulate it in such a way that he could create the conditions of usury. And then at the end, Zacchaeus does this restitution. But what I'm hearing you say is that the restitution was in response to Jesus coming into his home.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like him putting away the yeast, almost like creating space to receive this holy presence. He had to clean up,
Yep.
and he had to purge. And so there's this moment in which Jesus is an unusual force of restitution, because it's not merely the return to the status quo. There's a kind of movement past it that happens. So he says, half my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anybody, which means all the people he's defrauded through his work, I will repay them fourfold. So there's this kind of it goes beyond.
Yep.
And then a similar kind of dynamic might happen again with the whole taking of the inheritance ahead of time, and then the movement back and the acceptance back into the family, under what conditions people debate. In both cases, the figure of grace complicates and changes that simple restitution. Is that a clear reading? You know what I'm trying to say? There isn't a normal way of getting it. Grace does not work by simply a return to the status quo.
Oh, that's absolutely, no.
Yeah.
It's a recreation.
Yeah.
It's opening up a new way of being.
Yeah. But yet there's a kind of, in some ways, grace is described in the text by showing what the norm would be for restitution.
I think that that's given as, if you like, the very end. That's all that's left over.
Yeah.
Because the really important thing is the movement towards the person that opens them up.
Yeah. Yeah.
The broken eggshell as the chick emerges. That's what these things here. I'd have to think more to follow the Fitzmyer thing, but I'm very struck by how the words behold come various moments to do with the seeing. And the behold, yes, I wonder, because Zacchaeus stands and says to the Lord, behold, Idu, look here. the half of... There is something that sounds as though it's something new that's being said. It'd be interesting to know. The word behold, in Greek it's idu, which is from the same verb as to see. Yeah. As I said, this is chock full of to see, see and seek. And then in the one case, anablepsas, looking up, which is the same, it's the same verb in Genesis, where Abraham looks up and sees the place. In other words, Mount Moriah. And then
it also appears in verse 2. It also appears in verse 2, but we don't see it in our translation, which would be technically, and behold, there was a man.
yes, and behold, a man by name called Zacchaeus.
And look,
Yep.
would be a better,
Yep.
a Eugene Peterson kind of thing. And look, there
Yeah.
was this man.
And he sought to look to Jesus, and he sought to see Jesus, yes. So, the see verbs are all from Edain, except for the seeking, which is exete, and the looking up, which is anablepsas, but they're all eye-related. And the crowd says, and when they saw it all. So the crowd do some seeing too.
We have one more question coming our way from the I am struck that Zacchaeus' response of generosity has more to do with the experience. I'm sorry, I hope this wasn't already asked. Was this the same as we asked? I'm struck that Zacchaeus' response of generosity has more to do with the experience he has with Jesus than his compassion for the victims. That's kind of what I was noting. What does this mean for our work of forgiveness? That's a great question.
I don't know. I think that it would be an interesting case for all of us, or for any of us, I think it's certainly my case, that I started to be aware of being loved long before I became aware of how much harm I had done to other people. So it takes one some time to move from beginning to be included, to be able to become genuinely and sensibly, and not as part of emotional blackmail, aware of people one has hurt, and so able to start to move towards them. It just seems to me to be part of the process of conversion, and that God gives us time. I don't think that if we are always putting the cart before the horse, we will all turn into mutual emotional blackmailers.
I've also wondered about that, and it's occurred to me that perhaps there's something to the need to first find the humanity within yourself, to reclaim your own humanity before you can start to see it in others. There's perhaps, that then triggers and fuels your ability to look beyond yourself.
Yes. No, and that's my experience as a gay man. It was way into the process of my discovering myself, love as I am, that I was able to remember and recognize how brutally I had treated people weaker than myself at a time when I was too frightened to accept myself. And I think that's...
I'm not convinced this mic is working, but...
It's work. Now, am I audible? Well, it's working just fine, Chris, when I listen to you. I respectfully ask all of us, this is a large interior space, and I've learned from bitter experience myself that A, to hold the mic at a distance, B, merely to murmur into the mic only amplifies murmur. So, Chris, you're very, very clear. Thank you. I had a question about what you just pointed out. Maybe some awareness of one's own humanity then will, I think your word was, trigger awareness in others. And I know this is getting into which came first, chicken or egg. In this story, I see everything that Zacchaeus has heard about Jesus comes from outside Zacchaeus. To ask, it seems to me that to ask someone who has become so much the prisoner of her or his own, I think you said, heart armor, that's asking, to use theological language, that's asking that person to perform a work. You know, grab yourself by the scruff of the neck and get a look at your own humanity. What I see in this story is something unimaginable bursting into Zacchaeus' life. That's what allows him. That's the only thing that touches me when it comes from without.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right. Grace starts from outside. How we receive ourselves is not a self-induced thing. It's something received from eyes outside us. And then that changes our capacity to look, and it can enter into a mutually enriching, learning to look at each other better and better. But I think you're right. Telling people, learn to love yourself, is a terribly cruel instruction, because it's suggesting that introspection is the way to go, whereas actually it's when we find that, as you say, apparently miraculous, being looked at as we've never been seen before. We think, oh my God, I'm not who I thought I was. Let me become who I'm discovering myself to be towards others. Well, shall we pause for bundt cake and coffee and then come back to more losing and finding?
Thank you so much. It's now 9:55. Those of you at home, what time do you want to have people come back?
Well, let's take 5 minutes so as not to lose too
5
much.
minutes. So smoke them if you got them at home, and we'll do something here.
I don't know. There we go. It's working.
Where were you about? I couldn't understand where you were. Thank you, Susie. You weren't crystal clear. And the mic wasn't working when I had it.
That's because you're crystal clear.
Chris, I think that mic takes seconds to actually
Yeah,
start
but
working.
I left it on well past that time. They're telling me backstage that he's doing some cutting right now.
Okay.
All right, folks, I think we're going to get started again on the next meditation. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank Thomas Russell for his amazing bundt cake as well. From Plum Market, which is the best.
Good. Well, thank you for still being here. And now we're going to look at this chunk from Luke 15, which is the parable which I call the parable of the self-effacing father. And I hope you will see why I call it that and why that's important. Now, as Bill mentioned, with relation to our last reading, chapter 15 of Luke's Gospel gives us a very good sense of what this parable is about, because this is the third of three parables, the last line of which is effectively, come and have a party because he is found. Rejoice because he is found. The first one is the lost sheep. So the 99 ones that stay at home, and the good shepherd goes after the one that is lost, and when he brings it home, rejoices. The second one, so that's 99 to 1. Then there is the widow with her 10 coins, and she leaves aside the 9 and goes and dusts everything and finds the one, and then has a party because she has found her coin. So that's 9 to 1. And then the third one is 2 to 1. But the same line is at the end. The repeated theme of all these is rejoice. It's party. So the key thing here is going to be party, and we'll see why. Now, there's some suggestion that Luke, at this part of his gospel, is going through the book of Deuteronomy. One of the things that Jesus does in Luke's gospel is basically wander through the book of Deuteronomy, undoing lots of the negative provisions of the law. But also, we see him interpreting bits of Deuteronomy. And we'll see here that one of the pieces of Deuteronomy that he's interpreting is the passage concerning inheritance. The passage concerning inheritance in Deuteronomy, which is where we get the division of inheritance if it's between two sons, with 2/3 going to the elder and 1/3 going to the younger brother, but also where we get what happens to a rebellious son. He be taken outside the town and stoned. So remember that Deuteronomy is underlying a lot of what's going on here. But also, a text of Deuteronomy was used for the feast of the foundation of the temple, the setting up of the temple. And this is probably originally, a homily for the foundation of the temple, which was a feast that was celebrated at Jesus' time, and it looked back to the refounding of the temple at the time of the Maccabees, but before that to Solomon's initial founding of the temple. But it celebrated that within the framework of readings from Deuteronomy and the book of Genesis concerning brothers coming together, and the book of Malachi. Those were the readings involved. Brothers coming together, in particular Judah and Joseph. Those were the tribes that had to be, or Benjamin would have been in the case of Joseph, but the tribes coming together. Okay. With that as a background, let's start to have a look at this wonderful, wonderful tale, remembering that what is erudite for us was not erudite for them. And that's one thing which I think is hugely important for us to remember with parables, because we're so tempted to say, yes, parables, Jesus was talking about simple things that could be understood by the innocent and are not at all by the clergy. That's a nice thing, and it's basically that's the way that charlatans give out moralistic readings of things, because everyone understands moralism, but Jesus was not someone who preached simple moralism over the heads of less moralistic people. On the contrary, he was undoing moralism in rather specific subtle ways. So here, let's think of this. The image which I use is, I don't know whether when you were children you had these toys. A toy which I had in England was a Swedish wooden ball puzzle. It was a ball made of wood, which a bit like a Rubik's Cube, except that you pulled all the pieces out. You had this perfect ball made of bits of wood. You then took the pieces of wood out, and then you thought, oh, well, it must be easy to put together again. But in fact, it was extremely difficult to put together again, because there were different pieces that had to be put in exactly the right order in order for the whole to be built up again. Did any of you ever had a puzzle like that? Yeah? Well, I propose to you that a parable is rather like a Swedish ball puzzle, in the sense that it's something thrown forward that people then pick up. They notice that it's familiar sounding, but then the more they pick it apart, the more difficult it is to put together again. And then eventually, when they have put it together for themselves, then they know for themselves what it's really all about, which means that it's ceased to be information given by me, an authority, to you, and is something you know for yourselves independent of authority. You're not in rivalry with me. And that's part of the genius of parabolic teaching. It's how to get people to discover what's really going on for themselves by deconstructing their world and rebuilding it. And that's what we have Jesus teaching here. And this is a masterclass in exactly that sort of thing. So just imagine that almost every phrase from here would have rung bells in the listener at the time. So Jesus said there was a man who had 2 sons. Well, a huge amount of the law presumes people having 2 sons, and a huge number of stories in the Hebrew Scriptures are about 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. So, remember, Book of Deuteronomy, the shares were 2/3 elder brother, 1/3 younger brother. So he's going to get 1/3 share of the property. Now, there wasn't actually a proper provision in Jewish law at the time to give part of your property away before you died. It was possible, but it was very difficult to do. But one thing that cannot have been done for a reasonable property holder would have been for this to happen without everybody knowing about it. It wasn't as though, oh, I've got $100,000 locked in my study safe, so I'll give you 33.3 thousand and keep the other 66. No, it would have meant, for instance, selling the land and realizing the property. Now, one of the things which very few of us notice, but will become important at the end, is he says, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." I ask you to look at the next verse, the next line. So he divided his property between them. How often do we fail to notice that, in fact, at this stage, he gave all his property away? As it were, he wrote himself out of the picture. By law, he could receive any interests or profits made from the property now, but now the owners of his property were respectively 1/3, the younger brother, the younger son, and 2/3 the older son. They were now the actual owners of the property. We forget that. At this stage, he has effaced himself from being a property owner. That'll become very important at the end. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country. Well, remember, gathered all that he had does not mean, as I say, put the cash from the safe into a rucksack and go off on a holiday. It meant organize the selling of the bits of the estate, realizing his assets such that they could then become liquid enough for him to be able to take it off. This would undoubtedly have caused shame to our father in the locality. Everybody would have known about it. He traveled to a distant country And there it said he squandered his property in dissolute living. It's not absolutely sure that the word dissolute is right. Spendthrift, yes. We know how his elder brother interprets this, because he later talks about spending it on whores. But that's the elder brother's line. It may just have been that he wasn't very good with money. So beware the knowing too much about how he was. Maybe he just wasn't very financially competent. And incidentally, that would have been a very important point, because a good Jewish boy would be expected to go on a business trip abroad and to come home bearing a profit. So a good Jewish boy who wasn't good with money was not a good Jewish boy. And they took that very seriously. As you'll see, there were distinct ways of treating with disrespect good boys who had failed to take advantage of the Egyptians. People, you were supposed to come back from the Egyptians bearing loot. That was very much part of the understanding of how one conducted business amongst foreigners at the time. So, when he'd spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. Now, please notice that at every stage we have traveling to a distant country. The distant country that everybody would have automatically thought of when that word came up would have been Egypt. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he'd spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country. Again, Egypt. We have lots of memories, little hints of texts from Scripture. He began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. So, again, a perfectly normal thing in that country, but obviously a form of degradation for our good Jewish boy. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. In other words, he was beyond being degraded by this stage. He was just desperate. But then he came to himself. And it's interesting, he doesn't say he was struck with penitence, but he suddenly realized, I can't carry on like this. There's nothing particularly moralistic about this. He's just, I've realized something. How many of my father's hard hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. So, in other words, this is not a good place for me to be. It's a perfectly sensible and self-interested thing to say. But I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. Now, interestingly, this is a direct quote. The first half is a direct quote from Holy Scripture. It's actually a double direct quote. It was a quote from the Rite of Atonement. It was the equivalent of the I confess that we say at the beginning of Mass, and in your Eucharist, I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters. It was the equivalent of that in the Rite of the Atonement, but it was a direct quote from Scripture. Can any of you remember who says this line in Scripture? The nearest thing to I have sinned against heaven and before you. It's not who you expect. Well, I'll tell you, it's Pharaoh to Moses when Pharaoh is pretending to be penitent and trying to get Moses to stop the magic tricks. In other words, it's a fake penitence. It's not a real penitence. It's an entirely self-interested fake penitence that's being quoted here. And he says, I will get up, arising, I will go to my father. It's not arising, I will return to my father. The word return had a sense of penitence. To return was to be repentant in Hebrew. But no, he's just right and return and going. There's no sense of returning here. And we'll see that another place where we assume that the word return appears, it doesn't in fact appear. when he came to himself, he says, I will get up, and the rising, I will go to my father's house. That's almost a direct quote from the book of Chronicles, where Solomon arises and goes to his father's house, meaning David's place, which Solomon has now built as the temple, which he then inaugurates with a great sacrificing of a bullock. In other words, there's just a hint here that what's also going on is a son rising and coming into the house of his father, where there will be the great feast with the sacrifice of a bullock, which will be the foundation of the temple. There are all sorts of little references here that people will have picked up at the time, but as I say, we don't. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. In other words, he's purely self-interested. It's not that he trusts his father's love for him. It's not that he's sorry. It's just he's hungry and he wants to be back in a place where he can get something to eat. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Okay, so the father sees him and is filled with compassion. This is the key verb, esplanchthiste in Greek, was viscerally moved. The splanchni with a viscera was gut-wrenched. His father was gut-wrenched. And this is the same verb as the Samaritan is gut-wrenched when he sees the person lying by the side of the road. It's the same that Jesus is gut-wrenched when he sees sheep without a shepherd. This is a key word referring to the God who moves the bowels. That's the way I think King James usually referred to these things, or King James's translations, King James's translators. But here we have the curious thing. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him, fell on his neck and kissed him. And that's what it says in Greek. He fell on his neck and kissed him. That's a phrase that appears 3 times in Holy Scriptures. Can anyone tell me where who is the first person to fall on someone's neck and kiss them? So.
Esau is one of them. Esau and Jacob.
Esau is the first one. Esau is the first one. 10 points to you. Aren't you supposed to ask it as a question? Isn't that jeopardy? Yeah, Esau is the first one. Now notice, what is the relationship between Esau and Jacob? Was Esau Jacob's father? So our self-effacing father is behaving like an elder brother. In fact, he's the model elder brother in these circumstances. Remember that he was the elder brother who'd in fact been diddled out of his inheritance by his younger brother, and yet has the graceful response when, you remember, Jacob sends out a whole troop of, sheep, goats, cattle, dromedaries, dancing boys, dancing girls, the whole lot, in a desperate bid to try and buy Esau's favor because he's so frightened of meeting him. But Esau pays no attention to all that and just rushes up and falls on his neck. So please notice that the first example of this falling on the neck is not a father falling on a son's neck at all. It's an elder brother on the younger brother. What's the second example?
David and Jonathan?
No.
Is it in Acts chapter 20?
No, the Hebrew Scriptures. Acts hadn't been written.
But there is a moment where they fall upon Paul in his neck and kiss him.
Oh, yeah.
After, when he's giving his departure.
His departure speech. No, but remember that this is a commentary on Hebrew texts that people will have known at the time. Yeah. No, we stick to the Joseph story and Genesis here.
Yeah, that is Joseph.
The second person to fall on anybody's neck is Joseph falls on Benjamin's neck when he's brought back and recognizes him. So once again, an elder brother falling on a younger brother. And the third incident, same story. Also Joseph, but this time Joseph falling on Jacob, his father's neck. But it's Joseph, the son, who comes out from a great distance to meet his father, who's coming down from the from Palestine to Egypt, and falls on his neck. In fact, in no case at all is it a father falling on a son's neck. In every case, it's a brother or a son falling on a brother's or a father's neck. All of that is supposed to indicate to us something going on here. Now, notice that the father saw him and ran. Again, portly patriarch has to lift up skirts and run. This is not dignified. One of the reasons he might have had to run, and this would have been a distinct possibility, was that he needed to get to the city limits, the town limits, before the rest of the crowd arrived and saw that a spendthrift son who hadn't done good business with the Egyptians was coming back, because they might have engaged, there was a kind of a special rite called the mezuzah, which was the equivalent of ostracism, whereby you would have some nuts shaken at you, and that was a sign that you couldn't come back into town. So he needed to get back, he needed to do that before they were able to ostracize him. So he's making sure that he's able to be welcomed in. So the running actually has some importance there, but it's very undignified. In fact, at every possible opportunity, there is no self-importance in this father figure. He is self-effacing. So then the son says to him, he's practiced his little repentance line, his Pharaoh jumping through the hoop remark. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. The father pays no attention to him. In fact, please notice that the father doesn't ever address him. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. In other words, party. First reaction is party. But it's a quite distinct sort of party, because he brings out the robe, the best one. So this would have been the priestly garment, because this is the one who has been sacrificed and is being brought to life. Put a ring on his finger. This was what the Pharaoh did to Joseph. And sandals on his feet. Moses was now able to stand in the presence of the Lord, because despite it being on holy ground where he should take his feet off. Get the fatted calf and kill it, like Solomon, and let us eat and celebrate. In other words, the party. What the temple is all about is party. With the priestly one, who is going to do the celebrating, the son himself seems to have just disappeared into this. He doesn't appear at all from now on. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. This son of mine. So that's how he recognizes him and is now organizing the feast. Now his elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. Now, without looking at the text, turn your eyes up from the text and tell me what the slave replies.
This your brother has returned again, and your father has killed the fatted calf.
Okay, is that what most people remember? If you've looked at the text, you'll know that's not what it says, but you've cheated. Because it says, your brother has come. That's the exact translation. And it too is a reference to the book of Genesis and the Joseph story. Because in the book of Genesis, after Joseph and his brothers have got together and recognized each other, and Joseph has forgiven them, they start to have a great party. And they make such a row that it disturbs Pharaoh's residence. And Pharaoh sends some servants to say, what's going on? And the response is, his brothers have come. So this is the plural of the same verb. His brothers have come. It's not come back. It's not returned. This is not a penitential story. And your father has killed the fatted calf because he's got him back safe and sound. But then he became angry and refused to go in. Now, it's interesting that in the ancient understanding of the rite of atonement, which would have been included the sacrifice, anger came out. Those who were covered and were protected against the wrath. It was understood that the wrath went elsewhere because people were protected by the blood of the Lamb. But here, the anger doesn't come out from God. The anger is entirely anthropological. The brother is angry and refused to go in. What other angry brother was in the field? Cain. Exactly. The language refers absolutely clearly to Cain. So Cain has come in from the field, but is angry, and he refuses to go in to the feast. But the father comes out. What on earth is this father doing, behaving in this unpatriarchal way? At best, he should have sent his son out, the brother, or more probably a servant, instead of which the father comes out as if he were the servant to beg his son. Most inappropriate behavior for a father. But he answered his father, listen. So already here it's behold. Already quite an abrupt and rude way. For all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command. I've never let go of one of your commandments. I've never ceased to observe your law. So in other words, this is a very clear way of referring to how a good observant Jew at the time would have referred to obeying all the commandments. And yet you've never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. Remember Cain complaining about the success of Abel's sacrifice, whereas Cain was the horticulturalist, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, in other words, he refuses to recognize him as a brother, he treats this person as a father who's in some way been unjust to him, even though that has not actually happened. A son who has been unjust, who has withheld from him, who has given him tough commandments. But when this son of yours, don't recognize my similarity with him, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Now, devoured your property with prostitutes might also be translated, who has eaten your life amongst idolaters. Let's just treat it as the prostitutes. He puts the worst spin on what his brother has done. But the same thing could be referred to the one who gives himself in sacrifice, because that was what the priest was supposed to do. The priests at the sacrifice of the atonement gnawed at the portion of the Lord, which was the tripes, the entrails, which was how they identified with the life of the Lord. But to do that amongst the impure would have been too much generosity. That was supposed to be only amongst the non-pornon, the non-idolaters. So remember, double meanings with all these words. This could be a way of referring to your son has been a high priest but exercised the high priesthood in the wrong place before the impure. He's devoured your living with prostitutes. And yet you've killed the fatted calf for him. You've been prepared to go along with this sacrifice. But then the father says to him, he doesn't say son, he says child. It's interesting. Child. It's a tender term, but it's wrong to translate it to son here, and it's muddling because it's very important when he does how he refers to the other brother. Child, you are always with me. Offspring, you are always with me. And all that is mine is yours. In other words, what are you on about with this resentful attitude? I gave you everything at the same time as I gave him his inheritance. You've been in charge of your inheritance at the same time as he was in charge of his. All along, it's been yours. I haven't withheld anything from it. That you have regarded me as the sort of person who withholds things, that's your imagination. I've been effaced from before you all this time. It's been yours all along. You could have had any number of goats if you'd wanted them. And all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead. Here he turns back this son of yours. He says, nothing to do with me. The only relationship that matters here is the relationship between brothers. This brother of yours was dead and was come to life. He was lost and has been found. So what's the parable of the self-effacing father doing? Taking us completely out of any paternal understanding of God and saying that, if you like, God's paternity is shown in making fraternity possible. And that's what the celebration of the temple is for. There's no point in having a celebration of the temple unless it's for people being reconciled at this level with each other. And that is, if you like, the challenge which Jesus offers it. The parable ends on an entirely open-ended note. Are you going to take it up? Are you going to see that it's not a question of obeying laws, being resentful, being good, being bad, being penitent, being not penitent? None of those things matter. My rejoicing is in your being brought to life together. Do you see the extraordinary ways in which the self-effacing father works in Jesus' parable? Any sharing? How are we doing for time? Let's have a time check first.
It is 10:38.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes or so to...
Just as we're getting ourselves warmed up, and the thing that's striking me is actually the title of your meditation, The Self-Effacing Father. So the father is disappearing throughout the entire passage.
He starts by disappearing at the beginning.
Yeah.
But we don't notice that he's disappeared because we have our imagination. And he has to keep on re-disappearing throughout to make the point.
And if the father is in some ways not, obviously, a kind of analog to the incarnation, to Christ, what does that mean for our understanding of the reconciliation that Christ brings?
It's all about creating, we would now say, siblinghood.
Yeah.
It's an exercise at this level. It's a horizontal exercise. The attempt to make it a vertical exercise is always going to be a shortcut to being trapped, either in fake penitence or in resentment.
Yeah, and to pick up on what you said last night, it's a move sideways
This is a move sideways.
rather than a move up and down.
This is the
Yeah.
Father showing how am I to be worshipped in a party when people are together? I don't need me to be worshipped. I am party when people are together. Sir.
Just want to make sure we have the
Oh yes, the microphone,
mic.
so that you can be heard on Zoom.
So we'll maybe do Tom and then go over here to
Yeah.
Jonathan.
So this story, from my point of view, has parallels within my own birth family. So I have a sibling, the oldest sibling, who is not very accepting of my being gay. So literally every year my partner and I would return, my parents would throw us a party, great big family party to say hi to everybody, and my parents were very accepting of me and my partner, but my oldest sibling would stay away because of her sense of morality. She saw me as the way the brother in this story saw his younger brother. So to me it's very real. It's not a matter of a hypothetical theological story from the past, because this birth story, birth family drama is still playing out. And you know, she is now 75 and I'm 65, and I'm still trying to forgive and not play the victim or be the scapegoat, and trying to understand what's happening spiritually between us. So for me, this is a very real and powerful story.
Thank you.
And I think it was Jonathan or Eric, I can't remember.
Eric had his hand up.
I think Eric.
I always thought this was one of the most powerful stories in the Gospels. And but there's a whole bunch of things that occur to me. One of them is, I often wonder, why is there no prodigal mother? And my thought about that is she gave up a long time ago because the father was so permissive that she got tired of having to be the bad guy all the time. But really, it's called the prodigal son, but in more ways, I think it's about the recalcitrant older brother. And I remember hearing, I forget her name, the woman who was such a...
A.J. Levine.
No, the person I was thinking of was that African-American woman who was so articulate about scriptures and stuff. Her name will come to me.
Is that Phyllis Tribble?
No,
No.
you're getting, that's another one. But so she said, she was saying that that this was reflective of the dilemma in the early church, where the law-observing Christians and the faithful ones who had suffered persecution and everything, they were resentful of the new converts who were coming in and achieving cheap grace. You know, they didn't have to suffer as much and so on. And that this was very much what you were saying, is that the hard and fast, tried and true Christians were being encouraged to come into the party and stop clinging to their sense of self-righteousness and so on. So, and there was something else too. Oh, I know. It always tickled me that when the prodigal son, he says, "I will go to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. Then when he actually goes and he sees how receptive his father's being, he drops that last part. He just says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, but he forgets all about make me one of your hired servants. He thinks, oh, maybe I can cut a better deal here than I thought, you know. So he strikes me as, in many ways, the kind of story I've seen played out many times in families where there's addiction, and you have an addicted child or something, and they keep presuming upon the generosity of the family and so on. So there really needs to be a sequel to the story, but the basic tenet of as you were saying, of the self-effacing father and of a radical forgiveness that doesn't even wait till the son gets to the border of the property. He comes running down the road to meet him and gather him in, and that's the fundamental image. So.
I have the sense that, I think that I love the idea of the addiction thing, and I can imagine that being real. But I have the sense from the text that the point is that the father is cutting him off in the midst of his speech because he'd pay no attention to all this nonsense about fathers. The father said to the slaves, quickly, bring her up. In other words, the father is cutting him off, paying no attention to this nonsense business about
I have not heard anything this on. I haven't heard anything this good on this parable since I last read Robert Capen's Parables of Grace, the late Robert Capen. And he argues that the parable really should be called the prodigal father. If we read prodigal to mean wildly extravagant, absurdly extravagant. I think it's from Capen that I get the idea that the father, by dividing his property while he's alive, essentially doesn't just efface himself from the story, he drops dead. Because you can't, if you don't have any property anymore, who are you? You must have died so that your sons can inherit it. He moves himself absolutely off stage and underground. And as to the sons, I think this is Capen also, as to the sons dropping the send me to live in the bunkhouse with the hired hands, I think it's Capen who says the father is kissing the boy so hard that he can't get the rest of his speech out. Thank you very much.
Brother James, in a church that is very protective of a patriarchy. I'm struck by the title, the parable of the self-effacing father, the self-effacing patriarch. The word, I heard something so new and so important to me today, that the word in verse 31, then the father says to him, child, you are always with me. As a woman who lives with much resentment of stories of fathers and sons systematically mansplained to me in the Roman Catholic Church, I hear this anew today, refreshing and helpful, truly, to think of the healing of siblinghood, or and that horizontal notion that you're putting in front of us too, that is the healing answer, I think, to the broken arches or whatever that we have here.
No,
and I'm even thinking, like, practically, pastorally speaking, I do a lot of work with women in ministry. Like, how do we, this is one of our core stories, and it's a beautiful story. How do we continue to hear ourselves into this story?
Yep, no, and I think you're absolutely right. I think how do we separate, not in a destructive way, how do we separate the dynamic that's presented here from the texts from which it's taken? It is clearly a series of references to patriarchal texts. I mean, the story of Joseph, Esau, Jacob, these are all highly patriarchal texts. All the references, but it's deconstructing that whole world.
Well, and just to say, if I could just venture as well, it's when you think about Esau or Joseph, you're talking about interruptions to the patriarchy, right? So Joseph, the youngest, becomes the favored person of the patriarch, which is just not done, right? And then Esau gets cheated out of his birthright, and this kind of picks up on something that I'm seeing in this text anew, given your read of the younger son's false confession, much like Pharaoh, is that it's full of ritual failure. It's full of, like, the ritual of confession fails.
Yeah.
The ritual of obedience fails. The ritual of sharing of goods, the whole distribution of wealth, it's all out of sync. Everything is out of sync and everything is falling apart, but the party works.
Well,
The younger son disappears into the party.
the younger son disappears into the party,
Yes.
but remember, if this was, as I suggested, a homily and a parable told around the feast of the foundation of the temple is also a potential failure,
Yeah.
unless the elder brother comes to the party, which is why it ends open-endedly. The only way this works is sibling reconciliation.
Yeah.
Everything else is a failed ritual.
And is there any sense, I don't think this is the case, but I'm just interested what you think, is there any sense there is some kind of echo in this to, say, Matthew chapter 5, if you're bringing your gift to the altar? Is there a kind of weird intertextuality between those two, even though people tend to do that in different ways with the Gospels?
I think that this is, if you like, this is the formal working out of that
Yeah.
in a story. Very often Luke's big parable stories are workings out of
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Yeah.
There's a question from online, and this is from your deepest fan who's read every one of your books. So, yeah, exactly. There's no page noted this time. I love this, though. This person's dear to me and refuses to identify. How often is the question, do we make even ourselves victims to get or claim a sense of control? Because there's this sense, I mean, and to play with that a bit, the younger son is actually going back and he's rehearsing in his mind, how can I play victim in a way that will move the father?
Yeah.
And he plays it badly, but the father is moved nonetheless.
The father pays no attention to it at all.
Yeah.
I think that's the key thing.
Yeah.
And remember that this is one of the things that's difficult for us to understand. For me, it's key to Luke, is that there are no good people. Luke is not about grace being received by good people. It's about the graciousness of God entirely independently of whether anyone is good or bad. Yeah. He puts into stories the thing which Matthew says about, God makes the rain to shine on the sun to shine and the rain to fall, or whatever it is, whichever strange meteorological quirk I'm into, on the just and on the unjust and the good and the bad. And we find it so difficult to sink into that because we are so wedded to some or other form of works righteousness.
When I think, just to pick up on that as well, is when I think about the sequel to Luke in Acts, there is kind of these attempts to moralize the faith, and yet the whole story ends with Paul shipwrecked and climbing onto the shore. And so there's a sense in which you see, I'm thinking about Ananias and the whole gift to where there's false pretenses around what has been given and not given, and all of these, again, failures, but somehow the gospel continues of resurrection.
Yep.
It is 10:54,
Let's have break number 2.
and we'll come back.
Looking at my calendar to see when people call my.
Yeah. I've actually written that to, I've actually used that in a letter to like newcomers, you know, when like confirmation's coming around. I'll say, you've been feeling a bit like Zacchaeus, you know, enjoying the view from the trees. I'm here to invite you down. Well, I mean, I do think it's the role of the church. We're continually inviting you down out of the tree.
Oh, speaking of people in the back of the church, do you ever hear from Marcy Osborne?
She came by the table we had at the Pride Parade. Yeah, she came by.
I ran into her this summer. I was asked to stand in for another church, take a plate, and I'm going down the aisle, and there she is, right on the edge, looking me right in the face.
So a few weeks ago, I like made a passing reference to this parable of the sermon that we were doing on music, and you know, I didn't think to really go deeper with it. I just sort of described the apology as like, you know, the Father has no interest in the cooked up apology of the Son, and it occurs to me that I wonder if that's an interpretation that a lot of people aren't familiar with.
My first
In other words, the more largely widely understood is that it is about penitence.
right, and because the Son has said that, Zacchaeus, I have a great fortune back in the 70s. I used that to a wonderful woman in I've always given working with junior high class. Holly was very influenced by something like St. Louis Center, which then was the big thing at Christmas or was we meet together, we would meet once a week and hammer out following Sunday's drama, and we decided to do the parable of the prodigal son in 3 units, but throwing the end of each meeting over to the kids. At the end of the first meeting, what did the kid do with the money? Did he buy the Maserati or did he buy the Porsche? And the kids really got into an argument about that.
Yeah.
Then at the end of the second one, when the bottom was dropped out of everything and the girlfriends are gone and the kid's working as a ticket taker in a porn theater, and a letter comes from his father. The kid's living in LA or something, or Reno, and he tears up the letter and flushes it down the toilet, and we ask the kids at the end of that session, what did the letter say? And they really began to dig. And by the time we got to the third, I think it was Polly who said to me, let's describe the father running down the road so hard that he loses a sandal and doesn't even notice it as he throws himself on his scapegrace son. I got more out of it, I think, than the students did.
In that reading underwater class that we did, Jonathan, in that reading underwater class we did, to your point, when that you made, we actually did a night on, let's talk about the sequel to the story. And because there were so many folks with addiction history, a lot of them did imagine that's exactly right, that this thing just keeps repeating itself, you know.
Well, it is, and you get in the, this cycle of exploiting the kindness of people and stuff, and some kind of tough love has to come into the picture. Recipient of the tough love, and that's.
The devil thinks we're good.
I'd like to still wonder what happened to the mom.
Stuck at Discount Tire.
Discount tire?
Yeah, I was having my.
So you heard the butt cake, you're like, all right.
That's a. I thought it would have been done before I so I was busy on mine, but I was having my winter tire swapped.
Yes, boy, that's a little bit ambitious, but you're right.
Hoping.
Yes, yes. Frank, no, thank. Frank.
Take off my Gryffindor skirt. That's Gryffindor.
Yeah, no, I got this. And then Tom, you could be the photo bomber. Just who was that? I don't know. He's so nice. That's amazing. Send me that. I took that. We'll see. Yeah, you have to take a lot of pictures.
I used to be the chaplain at Grinnell.
So we're going to get started again, and I have a couple of questions that came in from the last session. One from the first session, and I want to address them because they're kind of interesting and important to me. And this was the statement that was asked. Could you please repeat the last statement about it being cruel to say you need to love yourself? And then I have one more after this one. Yeah, make sure.
Yes. We receive who we are through the eyes of others. We start doing that from our infancy. It's as we are looked at by others that we discover who we are. We are called into being by the regard of others. And that's a constant process, all our lives. It's how others see us that tell us who we are. We can become reactive to it. We can receive it. But we're dealing with it for the rest of our lives. The instruction, love yourself or forgive yourself, to me, is cruel because it fails to recognize that who we are always comes from what is in between us from another. It's effectively saying, look into yourself, as though any of us has direct access to who we are. We don't. We learn who we are through others. It's as we forgive others that we find ourselves forgiven. It's as I work out that the person who really annoys me because they're really like me, that I'm able to start to actually receive something like gentleness towards myself. So I think it's cruel to take people out of the dynamic by which they are in fact going to allow to find themselves forgiven or are enabled to find themselves loved by saying, navel gaze. None of us can start here. We are the symptoms. None of us with eyes can see our optic nerve.
Yeah.
We can see who we are through the eyes of others. So that's why I
I'm
said
so glad you said that. And the person who asked the question just said, oh, well, I could have just reread it or done it. But I think what you just said there was so important, because I also feel when people say that to you, you have to love yourself. It's really, not to get stuck in too much of a dichotomy here, but it's really just a law that's being spoken to you, a kind of obligation. If you love yourself, then everything's going to be fine. You're the problem, not anything else around you, not the relationships, not the quality of the space between. So thank you for saying that, and I hope the person who is here now will be able to see that and know it. Another question that came up, and I think it's a super question, but it's a kind of a juncture maybe. It says this: I have a desire to stand up for the older brother. He may have a point. He may have taken on the work of peacemaking in the family by caring for the father, by doing double the work, by being doubly overly obedient. He may also have felt abandoned by his younger brother. Can we find a way to understand the plight of the older brother in a way that is not shaming of the older brother? He has the power of being the forgiving victim as well, only as long as his dignity as being harmed is honored. And that's an interesting point.
That seems to me to be a very fair point, which is why the key thing in the father's speech to him is, but you've had all this all along.
Yeah.
The elder son's problem is not that he isn't right to have followed his father's commandment. It's not that he isn't even right to have not yet conducted a sacrifice using goats. It's that he hadn't allowed himself to actually receive everything that had been given. If one had received too soon, the other had refused to receive and was able, therefore, to put his resentment on the father. And the father would say, no, I'm not in the way here. It's all yours. Party. But so I think you're right. I think there's any of us, most of us have elements of the elder and the younger brother in our lives.
And one of the insights that you helped me see, to honor the question that was asked, is the Greek that is used is not son, but teknon, child, which of course is gender neutral, interestingly, to go back to your point. And so that teknon, it is a little bit dismissive, right? When you say child to a grown person. Or maybe it was a loving, I don't know. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, but I think the key thing is that it's not the word son.
Yeah.
He's not playing the game, your son.
Right, so he's trying to avoid the filial responsibility. He's just saying, child, this is, yeah.
I also think that it kind of goes to the heart of the parable. Does the son hear child as shaming or endearing? Does the son hear the invitation to the party as come, join, be with? Or does he hear it as something to be resentful over because I never got something like this? I mean, that's to me, that's the eternal choice that the parable invites us all to ask ourselves over and over again. And it's something that we continually have a choice. We can choose to be resentful or we can choose not to be.
And one of the backgrounds to that in the parable is that, of course, when the the servant of Joseph's brothers told the Pharaoh's servant that it was a party, the Pharaoh and his household rejoiced. They immediately then understood that this was something worth celebrating. So yes, I think that I hope you see the how interesting all the wooden pieces of the Swedish puzzle are when you start putting them together. There are an awful lot of things that seem familiar when you heard it the first time. When you actually look at how the familiar bits are fit together again, something quite different comes out. So I hope that it's just an interesting exercise in
Oh, I think this is great.
how the parable works.
I think it strikes me that it's almost like he's playing a different game. You know, the whole idea of the prodigal, the outgo, this abundant, crazy love, where, as you've been talking, I've been hearing that with this love self, if love is that outward relational thing, then I hear you. What you said makes sense, because you can't really do that within. You can't bite your own teeth. You can't see your own eyes with your own eyes. So if it's that outward motion, that the game that the Father, that God is playing, is that it's about always just, it's about the outward giving. It's about being love, where everyone else is playing a different game. What can I have? Give me my, bring in, give me my inheritance, and you never gave me this. Where he's going, I don't understand what you're talking about. Party, just like give out. It's an entirely different game and map that the paradigm of the father figure is playing, and that I've often heard, that we're called to be that. We can identify with both, the younger son and the older son, but that we're called to be, the father, and so to play that game, and to be love, give that out, love God with all your heart, all your mind, so that you become that love, and then when you can love the annoyer, or the persecutor, the victimizer, then you become more and more like God with just that abundant, sunshine on the just and the unjust. That's the game we're called to play. That's what I'm hearing.
And I think that there's with exactly that point, because it's always about someone doing something to us first, and whether we're able to perceive that. So, for instance, with relation to the older brother, it says at the end, so the father comes out. As I mentioned before, this is the least possible patriarchal thing to do. The father comes out of the party. It's just conceivable that the brother might come out, but much more probable that a servant will come out. So the father comes out disguised as a servant. What sort of servant comes towards us who is in fact the self-effacing father to invite us into the party? That's always how are we going to tell when we are receiving an angel unawares, as it were? But it seems to me that that's part of what's going on here. It's inconceivable that the father figure would come out of the party. Therefore, the coming out suggests someone in a different sort of drag. So let's imagine that. Can we move on from that? So, I now have, for our last session, I have 3 sheets of paper, of which 2 are Lucan texts, and 1 are the references, so that you can follow along roughly what I'm saying. But I call this a tale of 2 Theophanies, because the Transfiguration and the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke are very clearly parallel as different moments in which God makes God's self present and visible in a rather striking way. And one of the ways that we can tell that they're parallel is because Peter, John, and James are chosen to be the witnesses in both cases. So let's start by having a look at the text of the Transfiguration, which I think that you had recently as a gospel, right? And you had it just before Lent. We had it last week in Lent. But let's have a look at what's going on here. So now about 8 days after these sayings, and the sayings in question were Jesus telling them about his death and resurrection, and them not understanding what he was talking about. It was in the Lucan version, Peter recognizes him as the Messiah or the Son of the Most High, but we don't get the "get thou behind me, Satan" bit in Luke. But they're busy not understanding the first announcement of the Passion, when Peter, James, and John are taken to be witnesses to this theophany. And after 8 days, a reference apparently to the book of Chronicles, where when it comes to the cleansing of the temple by King Hezekiah, it takes them 8 days to shift through all the rubble and all the difficulties until they come to the sanctuary of the Lord, the place where the Most High is to be seen. So, we're prepared now for a temple vision, a sanctuary vision. Remember that what we have with these two theophanies is two different moments in the enactment of the ancient rite of atonement. The ancient rite of atonement in which the great high priest would take the blood of the lamb, or one of the lambs, into the holy places, sprinkle it around, and then come out. When he came out, he would be in an absolutely brilliant white robe, which would be even more brilliant white because it would have as its backdrop the rich colored tapestry of the temple veil. He would come through it, and then immediately the other priests would rush up and put on him the high priestly tunic, again woven without seam, which was made out of the same material as the temple veil. But the first thing they would see before he went up to the altar of sacrifice would be this brilliant white figure. And then he would go up to the altar of sacrifice, where they would offer the portions of the lamb, and they would then sprinkle the blood. The priests would nibble, would gnaw on the Lord's portion, which was the entrails of the lamb, and would burn the nice bits that we get to eat of the lamb, and then they would sprinkle blood over the people. But so we're having two different moments in this enactment, which we know Luke follows very carefully through this. The presence of the Levitical rite and the prophecy from Isaiah concerning the presence of the Lord in the temple. I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. We can see that, the conclusion of that being fulfilled in the Acts of the Apostles, when the Lord is lifted up, and then his train fills the house the next day. The house is filled with flame, and then after that the house shakes a couple of days later. So the gradual enacting of all the ancient elements of the rite of the atonement is one of the things which we get in Luke's gospel. But this is the moment when the high priest, who is the Son, clad in white, appears. They're being given a glimpse of the Most High coming into creation in order to do this. So Jesus is explaining to them, by means of this, which they get to witness and are not going to understand properly for some time, he's trying to explain what's going on, what it is that he's there to do. So they go up to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, and again, the high priest would enter into the holy place and pray. That was what the high priest did, was meditate with the angels. As he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became dazzling white. So the first phrase is this: the appearance of his countenance was altered. To eidos tu prosopou. And this is the exact Greek that in Hebrew is translated Peniel. It is what Jacob saw when he wrestled with the angel. Do you remember? He wrestled with the angel all night. Then the angel gave him sciatica. And and he said, he establishes a sanctuary site because he says, I have seen the face of the Lord. But in fact, it's I have seen the form of the faces in Hebrew, but the form of the face in Greek. The face is the plural because it refers to God, not meaning many gods, but so much that it's the plural is the only way of giving giving credence to the richness of the singular. But the form of the face here, it unquestionably means that this was the Lord. This was not a reflection of the Lord. When Moses saw the Lord, his face was chromatos. You remember when he had to put on a veil when he came down so that people wouldn't be burnt by his face because he'd seen the Lord. But that was the reflected chromatos from which we get chrome. The reflected glory was on Moses' face. But here it is the face itself that we're seeing. As he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his garment, his raiment, became dazzling white, exastrapton. This is exactly the word used in Ezekiel and Daniel about the vision of the Lord. It's the particular, it's the lightning white, the almost terrifying white. This is not the white of angels. This is the white of the Lord himself. So this is a theophany. And behold, two men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. Well, why Moses and Elijah? Remember that Jesus had just talked to them about death and resurrection. And Moses and Elijah were considered representatives of death and resurrection. Moses, remember, had died before getting to the promised land. He'd given the law, which was only valid while you were alive. Moses himself had died, not able to go into the promised land. Elijah was associated with resurrection. Why? He was the one who was carried to heaven in a fiery chariot in the sight of Elisha, and he was the one who was thought to be going to return, according to Malachi, before the coming of the Lord. Hence the discussion in the Gospels about whether John the Baptist was in fact Elijah. So, the people who are interpreting what is meant by Jesus' death, according to the law, and what is meant by the resurrection, as it were, Elijah. But in fact, it's going to be greater than either of those. They were just pointing towards it. And they appeared and spoke of his departure, his exodus, which of course is going to be much more than the exodus. His departure, which is to be accomplished in Jerusalem. That is to say, the definitive self-giving in sacrifice, which he is to perform. Now, Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. And when they awakened, they saw his glory and the two men who were standing with him. Now, this is a wonderful reference to Psalm, let me see if I can remember it, Psalm 17, 16, depending on which version, Psalm 17, which ends, when I awake, I will contemplate his likeness. His likeness, his form, his glory. So this is a reference to that psalm, and is another indication that it is the form of the Lord who was seen. And remember that this was something which was controversial at the time. The more strict people who followed the law of Moses and the Deuteronomic form said, and this was something which is repeated in Deuteronomy, his voice you heard, his face you did not see, his form you did not see. The notion that the form of God could not be seen and never had been, not even Moses had seen the form of the Lord. They'd seen some angelic vision, which is why the law was given by angels. That would have been an understanding according to the law of Moses. As opposed to the temple visions, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. With a beautiful anthem by Stainer, if I remember, which I remember from my Anglican youth, beautifully sung. It's one of the loveliest of those anthems. But also Ezekiel, who saw the Lord with all this whiteness, and in his midst one like a son of man. So the notion of a human form that was part of the divine form, which was truly shocking. It was one of those passages, the book of Ezekiel, that was not supposed to be read out loud because it contained this anthropomorphism, which was regarded as truly shocking at the time. But so here, when they awakened, they saw his glory. In other words, they saw the form, the temuna. The Hebrew is temunateka. When awakened, we saw his glory, his form. And the two men who stood with him. In other words, they saw the Lord, and by the side of the Lord, people who were humans. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's well that we're here. Let's make 3 booths, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." In other words, Peter starts to interpret this, not entirely stupidly, as an occasion for a sort of let's say, impromptu Feast of the Tabernacles, which was held shortly before the Feast of the Atonement. In other words, he's kind of got the liturgical bit right, but doesn't understand what's really going on, not knowing what he said. As he said this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And this is a glorious moment, because the cloud overshadowing them is exactly what happens at the end of the book of Exodus, when the cloud overshadows the tabernacle. That's the presence of the Most High, indicating that the Lord is present in the tabernacle. But in Exodus 40:35, Moses cannot enter, can't go in. But they find themselves entering the cloud along with Jesus. The cloud is around, but they find themselves entering the cloud. So a completely new dispensation is being shown to them in advance. They are going to be on the inside of the form, of the vision of the one like a son of man inside the vision of the Most High. They're actually going to be taken into that. And of course they don't understand what this is about. It's literally going to be several years after Pentecost until they finally work out what this means. It's about the Council of Jerusalem that it takes to work this out. What it is like to be on the inside of the cloud that Moses could not enter into, but which has come to envelop them into it. All of that is being shown in advance here. And the voice comes out of the cloud. Remember, they're inside the cloud at this point, but the voice comes out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." So, as at Jesus' baptism, the only paternal voice we ever hear in the New Testament, and particularly in Luke's Gospel, is to say everything delegated to the horizontal level. There is nothing specifically paternal in the New Testament. The only specifically paternal thing is complete self-delegation to the fraternal. And that's one of the things we forget. It's absolutely essential.
Would you repeat that last sentence, please?
Yes. Absolutely central to the New Testament, and particularly Luke's reading of these things, is that the paternal completely delegates everything to the horizontal, to the level of siblingicity. There is no longer an outside, from on top paternal voice. The only presence of the outside, from on top voice is to say, from now on, everything fraternal. It's a continuation of our theme of the self-effacing father. Everything is now to be worked out at this level. What is good, what is bad, who you are, what it is to be a son, a daughter, all is to be worked out on this level. We often forget that. We often think that we have access to the Father by some other route than via the purely horizontal level. But it's specifically the fraternal instruction is stay only at the fraternal. That's, if you like, one of the shocking things, which usually, mired in atonement theory as we are, we ignore that and imagine that somehow he says, oh yeah, we accept that. Jesus has got to give us some commands, but still we've really got to get outside and somehow satisfy the Father. The Father is entirely satisfied with us listening to the Son. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. In other words, Moses, Elijah, everything that had happened before is now in this single figure whom they are now going to accompany as he takes them down the hill and eventually up to the altar of sacrifice in Jerusalem. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. And I just want us to think why that might have been. I think it might have been because they could only have had the very first inkling of what this was about. If you like, being on the inside of this vision is something which we get in little partial shots in our liturgical life over the years. But the ability to actually sink into what is going on here, which Luke wonderfully puts together by means of this collage of references, is something which is giving us a new narrative of which we are mostly entirely unable to comprehend for a very long time and gradually work our way into as we discover ourselves entering the cloud. Okay, now let's look at the parallel part of that to Gethsemane. And here I'll go quite quickly. When I say Gethsemane, I shouldn't, because in Luke, it doesn't refer to Gethsemane. We get Gethsemane mentioned in Mark and in Matthew, but not in Luke. And I think there's probably a reason for that, because he emphasizes the Mount of Olives, which of course was the place where the Messiah was to appear. It was the last place that the Messiah had been seen in Ezekiel's vision. The holy place, the Holy One left the temple in Ezekiel's vision, perched on the wall, perched on the city wall, perched on the Mount of Olives, and whoop, went off. That was in Ezekiel's vision of the Most High leaving the temple. And according to Zechariah, the Most High would come back on the Mount of Olives. So here we have the Most High coming back on the Mount of Olives. This is, if you like, the dark theophany. We had the light theophany in the Transfiguration. This is the dark theophany. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed. Now, why about a stone's throw? This is interesting. Again, this is the only gospel that makes this reference. One of the things that was to happen was that if any animal were to come close to the mountain while the Lord was communing with Moses, it should be stoned. So here we have the fulfillment of the Lord on the mountain with Moses, but in this dark place and with nothing coming close. About a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed. Now, why does he kneel down? Because in Mark, he lies down. Matthew lies down. But here he kneels down, and it's for a very good reason. He lies down, he kneels down because his sweat has got to be able to run down. If he's lying, it's not going to be very easy for the sweat to run down. We'll see, we'll get to that in just a second. Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Now, they had been singing the psalms between the place of the Last Supper and the mountain. The psalms were the Hallel psalms. It included the I will raise the cup of salvation psalm. And here, Jesus is going to enact the undoing of temptation. I'm afraid that because of our tendency to make psychological readings, we tend to assume that what's going on is Jesus having a struggle with his will. And therefore we have, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. What's going on here? He's enacting the difference between the divine will, the God's plan from the beginning in the garden, and the human will, which succumbed to temptation. This is Adam. Adam is absolutely important. Here, Jesus is undoing what happened to Adam. So the Greek word thelema there, where it appears in Luke's Gospel, it appears either with the way in which humans think or the way in which God thinks. It's not the modern psychological term, and it's quite important that otherwise we imagine Jesus is engaged in some sort of psychotic self-discussion. Am I God? Am I really God? Should I be obeying myself? Should I be obeying someone else? Nonsense. That's not what this is about at all. This is about Jesus undoing Adam's fall, Adam's temptation into disobedience. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. Well, this is a reference, and here we have, this is a reference to Deuteronomy 32:43. And this is on the sheet which I gave you, the Tale of Two Theophanies. And this is an incredibly important verse for the early Christians. And it appears as follows in the Septuagint, the Greek version. The modern Masoretic text has altered this, probably because it was so important to early Christians. Because the chunk of Deuteronomy that was found at Qumran is more like the Greek than it is like the modern Hebrew. So the suggestion is that the Jewish text that we now have was altered after Christianity. A generation ago, it was impossible to say that without it being assumed to be an anti-Semitic remark. But now, mercifully, there are a good number of very sensible Jewish scholars who understand exactly how this worked and realize that there was a very considerable process of alteration of texts at the beginning of rabbinic Judaism. But here we have the sons, the angels of God, worshipping him, and the angel rendering vengeance or rendering atonement, because the word is the same, and recompense justice to his enemies. This appears twice in the New Testament. It appears more than twice in the New Testament. It appears twice in the Gospels. Here, at this point, where the angel comes to prepare him for the act of atonement, and where this appears in John's Gospel, you remember, is when the Greeks come with Philip to find him, and there is a voice, which is the voice of an angel. That's the moment when the angel who is preparing him, strengthening him to do the atonement comes. But so here is the angel strengthening him. Then an angel appeared to him and gave him strength. So this is the preparation for the atonement. And in his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And strangely, we refer to this as the the sweat of blood. But it wasn't of blood. It was sweat which became mixed with the red dust and therefore looked like blood. And his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And why is this important? This is a series of puns in Hebrew, because red, blood, earth, and Adam all have the same root. They're all dam or Adam. So what is happening here? He's fulfilling, if I can find it, Genesis 3:19, where it says, out of the sweat of your brow shall you live until, I forget until when, but Genesis 3:19, I wish I had written it out there. That's what's being fulfilled here. In other words, Jesus is shown here as getting right what Adam had got wrong. That's the purpose of what's being lived out here. Jesus is finally bringing to an end the curse of Adam. The prophecy of Genesis 3:19 is being fulfilled. The Father's will, as opposed to the human will, is being enacted and made possible, so that the one who has come in is coming in not only as the Son of Man, but as the first Adam, the original Adam. So creation is being renewed completely, starting from this point. Why is that so important? It's important because over the next few chapters in Luke's Gospel, we have Genesis moving backwards to the creation. Remember, Jesus is taken to the cross. The first thing that happens is that he's crucified between two thieves. In other words, the holy place with the two seraphs. But the two seraphim here are fallen. But one of them recognizes Jesus, and Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." In other words, where the presence is with the two seraphim, that's where they will be together in the holy place. It's understood that the holy place was a microcosm of paradise. At that stage, the lights fail, the sun goes out, and darkness covers the earth. In other words, Genesis, the order of creation is being undone. And after that, Jesus breathes out his Spirit. In other words, the Spirit goes back to hovering over the world before creation. So from Gethsemane to Jesus' death, Genesis is being run backwards. And of course, then the Spirit is given by the Father at Pentecost. The whole thing is brought alive again. So just to indicate why the Adam reference is so important here, because it's part of the whole movement of Genesis run backwards, which culminates in the crucifixion. But when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why do you rise? Sleep, rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." So he's the beginning and the end were about not entering into temptation, and in the midst, him reenacting Adam, so as to make it possible from now on that those of us who begin to be able to live this out start to be able to live as a new Adam in the new creation. We won't. I don't need to go on for the. This is the moment. You know, these are the parallel passages to that. There are interesting things that go on thereafter. First, Judas comes, one of the 12, kisses Jesus. Jesus said, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Then those say, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Why was this a problem? It doesn't actually say the slave of the high priest. It was the servant, I think, of the high priest. Why was this important? Well, one of the things that would prevent the high priest performing the sacrifice of atonement is if the high priest had any wound or cut or bloodshed. And the agent, as was done to the agent, so was done to the principal. So if any of the high priest's servants had been injured and was bleeding, that nullified the high priest's capacity to perform the sacrifice. So what is Jesus doing when he instantly restores the person's ear? Effectively, he's saying, none of this matters, because the real high priest is going to perform the sacrifice anyhow. Stand-in is no longer needed. If you like, the dress rehearsal pastiche, the real thing is now going to happen. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple who'd come out, have you come out as against a robber with swords and with clubs? That's rather a nice reference to the story of Goliath. Goliath mocked David in this way, but of course it was David who came not with sticks and stones and clubs, but now I will face you down in the name of the Lord. And then he slaughters. So effectively, Jesus is putting Goliath into their minds so as to indicate that he is the son of David, and that's what he's going to fulfill. When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. The laying of hands was what the high priest did to the lamb, the one that we call the scapegoat. Remember that in the rite of atonement, there were two lambs, or two goats, it didn't particularly matter. One was killed, the one that stood in for the Lord was killed and its blood used in the holy place, and the other stood in for Azazel, stood in for the demon, and on it hands were laid, and then it was driven out. So again, wonderful irony here. When I was with you day after day in the temple, this is Jesus referring to himself teaching in the temple, but also the Most High. When I was in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. You didn't. Place your hands on the sheep. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. So, the Theophany in the dark place. I hope that you see how the Transfiguration and Gethsemane work as preparing and showing what is going on in the crucifixion. This is Luke's brilliant way, through a collage of references, of opening us up to what is happening. How are we doing for time?
It is 11:48.
We have some time for questions.
Chris, up here.
I'm going to ask you to unpack atonement in your special way, just a little bit more. The theology that you've wrestled with yourself.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, one of the things that scripture scholars used to say was Luke has no theology of the atonement. I think this is complete nonsense. No theology of the atonement. Meaning that Luke obviously doesn't have a modern or a semi-modern Protestant atonement theory. But of course, and that is of course perfectly true. But what Luke has is a lived out enactment of the ancient rite of the atonement in the midst of the people of his time, shown by sign. And that's what we've been looking at. Now, why is this important? because this is all about God giving something to us, which was how the ancient rite of the atonement saw this. The ancient rite of the atonement was, on the feasts when it was celebrated, that God, if you like, made himself sacramentally, as we would now say, present in the person of the high priest, who made himself symbolically present in the lamb who was killed, because otherwise the high priest, who was Yahweh for a day, would have to kill himself in the ceremony. Instead of which, the lamb stood in for him. That's what those two lambs were doing. But the understanding behind it was that this is God coming into the midst of human wrath and anger in order to put creation right from within, to weave a protective skein over creation such that everything might start giving glory to God instead of being bent down into futility. The two Hebrew values schemes, if you like, was on the one hand divine wisdom, which is everything in creation shining and giving glory to God as you begin to see what everything is for and see the presence of the Creator shown in everything that is, or the reverse of that, futility, vanity, in which everything that in principle might have pointed to the Creator somehow falls short, fails to, so that we're stuck in a sense of futility and not quite achieving purpose, not quite getting there.
Is there a sense then, just to pick up on one theme, in the Transfiguration, Jesus is put in line with the prophets. In the Gethsemane, or the Mount of Olives, and the trial, he's kind of put in line with the priesthood. But then something else that you mentioned that I think maybe picks up on this is Christ is in some ways the second Adam, right? So because he is accomplishing what the first Adam failed to do. Is that another?
But it's all these things at once.
Yeah, no, without question.
Yeah.
So, but do you include the Adam? Because the reason
Absolutely.
I find that coincides with, if you look at the book of Romans and Paul's whole Adamic atonement, which is the second Adam has come to recreate creation from the beginning.
Remember, the creation story, the Adam creation story, is a laicization of the Adam story in Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Which we have in a corrupted form, but it's about the throwing out from the holy place and the temple of a bad priest, which has been in a corrupted form turned into a king of Tyre or a king of Sidon. But the base story behind Genesis story is Ezekiel 28. I think Ezekiel 28, but anyway, Ezekiel, I forget what chapter, I think it's 28. But if you like, the original story of the garden and the being thrown out and all that is there. What you have in Genesis is the laicization of that.
Yeah.
And what you have in the New Testament is Jesus fulfilling both of those.
Yeah.
Becoming the initial great high priest, the Son, if you like, the normative human, the one who is the figure of the Son of Man within the vision. So all of those are being fulfilled.
And not to just for those of you watching here, this, if you look all the way up at the top of the stained glass, you'll see that there's a Christ on the cross, and below is a skull that's right below at the foot of the cross. Do you see it way up there? And
yes.
That is traditionally known as the skull of Adam, when you would depict. And so it's funny. I only noticed that little fold in the kind of baked-in theology of the architecture, which kind of goes along. So I'm sorry to show that off, but it's just something I just found it cool.
Well, no, I don't think have I completely answered your question?
Yeah.
It's just so, I think what you're talking about is so important, and I just don't want us to lose it. Because it's a subtle shift on atonement theory
Oh, yes.
that we are so burdened, right?
Yes.
And I just want, we are so burdened as Christians in terms of theology of atonement.
Bad atonement theology.
Bad atonement theology.
This
And
is
I know
God-
this is something you've given so much to, and I'm trying to draw your wisdom out here.
Yeah, well, I don't know
With these
my wisdom, but the notion that this is something done for us,
Something
that
done for
opens
us.
up possibilities for us to become something much more than we are, rather than something done for us transactionally, such that we must now behave in little boxes.
Yeah.
There is all the difference in the world between someone actually coming into our midst so as to undo a whole way of us being together, so as to make it possible for us to discover new ways of being together. That's a whole different universe. That's the relationship between atonement and creation, than there is the, you've screwed up, I've paid the price, now behave. Which I'm afraid is the moralistic version of Christianity, to which I'm afraid we've become used to it, and many people assume that it is Christian orthodoxy. It isn't. It's a terrible, terrible re-Aztecization of
So, and just to pick up on that whole idea of sacrifice, and I didn't mean to throw in the Adam thing. I wasn't showing off the church, I promise you.
No.
But it was
No,
like one of the folds in it is that you could see it in the other pieces of the scripture. But the fact that he does this within, in a sense, the context of prayer, and the whole idea of like sacrifice and prayer being essentially the same thing, right? And so there's an element of satisfaction that happens in that Jesus prays a prayer that we can't. To do it all for us.
And he prays, that's part of the parallelism with the Transfiguration. It starts in prayer. But this is the high priestly prayer which we get in John 17, in John's Gospel. What we are getting here on the Transfiguration in Gethsemane is the high priestly prayer in real time, as it were.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
In Art of the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Rite, the first place Christ goes is to hell, Sheol, whatever you want to call it, the place of waiting, not necessarily suffering, but wait, of the righteous in the Old Testament. And the first people he releases or brings to holiness, or however you want to say it, were Adam and Eve. And this is a marvelous, it's shown, like I say, in art. I particularly think there's it's from a painting, a wall painting, a fresco in Italy in a little town, and I can't even remember it. But that I just find very interesting. He according to the belief, that's where he goes before anything else.
Well, it's one of
Before
the
he appears on earth.
it's one of the most beautiful readings for Holy Saturday, which is my favorite day of the year, because it's the only day when there's no liturgy. And
I can relate.
there's the reading for the office of readings in the Catholic Church is taken from, I think, a 4th century homily, but it's precisely about that. It's precisely about Jesus speaking to Adam and Eve and all the other people in waiting and bringing them to life on Holy Saturday, so before, as you say, before the resurrection. So if you haven't read that, I strongly recommend it. It's a very, very beautiful understanding of exactly what you're...
Could you repeat what that text is again?
Well, I think he's called something like Isaac of Serog or something like that. I forget who the name of
I don't know.
But if you look at the Office of Readings for Holy Saturday, the Office of Readings for Holy Saturday, there are 2 readings, and one of them is this wonderful, I think described as a 4th century homily or a 3rd century homily, whatever it is, but it's an account of exactly what you're describing. And yes, there's a wonderful icon which shows Jesus breaking loaf and stretching out his hands to Adam and Eve.
There's yes, I love that one, when he's pulling everybody out of,
Pulling
out of the
everyone
grave.
out,
Yeah. This is a question from online. Is it accurate to think of Jesus as the last victim? Jesus takes our shame to the grave. We now can live with the resurrected love and joy and share that abundance of forgiveness. Is that...
Yeah, I always think of it as Jesus detoxifying shame. Because I think if we make it too sweeping, then, if you like, then there are no categories that we can actually inhabit in our own experience.
And then in terms of the victim, I think also this question's like wrestling with the scapegoating mechanism being subverted by Christ,
Yes.
which is such a key move that you make that, you know, I think we'll have a chance tomorrow night to go into that much deeper, because that to me is the undoing of the scapegoating mechanism on the cross, and how that it both is a sacrifice, but it is the end of sacrifice.
Yeah. Yes.
Is that? Can you say a little bit more about
Yes,
that?
I think that Jesus is occupying the space into which we typically put each other in a desperate attempt not to be put in it ourselves. And Jesus is saying, I know you do that. I know that's the kind of thing you do. And I'm not even going to rub your faces in it. I'm going to occupy that space so that no one ever need occupy it again. And because I've occupied that space, it won't work anyhow if you do it, because I've shown that it's simply a mechanism, something which you do, not something which anybody has to do, not something that actually makes anybody good. I'm occupying that space so that you no longer have to do it. Now, if you want to come and play friends with me, who am the sort of person who you would throw out, then that's going to be wonderful. We're going to create a whole new way of being together. And you can find me in the sort of people you might be about to throw out.
That's brilliant.
It strikes me that's the theme of the self-effacing God once more from the last reading we looked at.
Yeah. One more question from online, and this is going back just a bit, but it's really interesting. I'm appreciating the focus on siblicity. Yet, when Jesus is asked to teach them to pray, he begins, Our Father. Might you put these together in understanding for us?
Not really. I don't really know how to answer that.
I think the question is that.
Oh, I think I understand the question. Yeah. I don't think I have an answer.
Well, can I just throw something out that just to?
Yeah.
I mean, just because I'm never shy. What if, in one way to look at the Father in Luke is to see a detoxifying of masculinity and patriarchy?
Of course.
So maybe, and what's curious is that Jesus will still engage in, as you will, the language game of using the term father. But of course, it's a father unlike the patriarchal father that is often assumed, is more like the self-effacing father. And as much as we struggle with fatherhood, all of us know fathers, that some we had, some we wish we had, who were able to kind of detoxify the role.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. The emphasis on father is to indicate that you have no earthly father. That is one of the most radical teachings. Literally every human reference to paternity is an idol. Not every human reference to maternity, but every human reference to paternity is an idol. Thou shalt not call no man your father. So that when Jesus promises future to his disciples, he says, you will have houses and property and sisters and brothers and mothers and persecutions. But he doesn't offer you more fathers. It's absolutely rigorous. There is a radical deconstruction of patriarchy presupposed in the notion that you only have one father, and he has nothing whatever to do with any earthly structure. So if you are a patriot, then you're an idolater, because you have a fatherland. If you have church fathers, then you probably have too foundational a view of what being church is. If you call priests father, well, then you're clearly joking.
Most times, yes.
But I think that that's right. I think that the answer is paternity is always something that needs to be deconstructed. Maternity, much less so. Jesus is perfectly happy for us to have plenty of mothers. Jesus is happy to refer to himself in last Sunday's Gospel as a hen. In fact, the only animal he ever compares himself to is a hen. Pronouns, she and hers, as we would say in modern.
We don't have a hen icon here for Jesus.
No, it's very rare.
We have a couple questions. Tom, and then I'm forgetting your name, I apologize. Joe.
May I just grab a thing of water before?
Please, I'm so sorry. While you're getting there.
Well, I know we're out of time, but at some point in the future, I would really like more discussion about atonement and alternative theories of atonement. And I'm a person who has a great problem sitting through the Eucharist liturgy because of the images of blood and sacrifice. And I understand the liturgical roots of that, culturally and literature, but I do think we're sending the wrong signals about violence and God. And I wish somehow we could wrestle with that more.
That's a beautiful, one of the things we will do in the future, which we did a few years ago, and I'm sure I would teach it better this time, is we did a simple course called Why Did Jesus Die? And you're absolutely right. That's a great thing to think more about as we go forward. But I think we've addressed some of that. Do you want to go to Joe, his question?
I think that's going to be central to tomorrow's discussion.
Yes, that is going to be, tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Stay tuned. Same bat time.
I just want to make the comment that at least in Matthew, I can't find it in Luke at the moment, but it's our Father. So it's not my Father, but our. It's the whole community's. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then in John, that's brought out because he uses my Father the whole time until when he speaks to Mary Magdalene. That's the very first time he has created siblingicity so that it's now our Father.
I think because of our time, I think we are going to bring this to a close. Would you all join me in thanking James for just an incredible retreat today? That was so wonderful and so beautiful. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in online. We had 53 people, 53 distinct views online last night, which that actually is oftentimes more than one person. We have a whole calculus for that you don't want to know. And I want to thank everybody online for writing in. Those were beautiful questions, those of you who are online. And we're going to send this out again to everybody. And it's been so rich. And I really would like to see, we should get these transcribed as well, because such powerful words. So thank you so much, James.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. God bless you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yeah.